From Imperial College London, welcome to this special lecture vodcast.
Let me just start. I want to start in the Renaissance, if I may, and let me draw your attention to this remarkable painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, which is in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Brussels. And here's King Nimrod in the bottom left-hand corner with his architect, and he's contemplating this vast edifice that's being built by his workmen. Over it are huge investment in the latest modern technology with cranes and pulleys and men like ants swarming over every aspect of the Tower of Babel. It's 14 stories high, it stretches from earth to the heavens, and it's only when you look at Bruegel's picture very carefully can you see that it's very clearly a comment. And the comment, of course, is that, first of all, this building is unworkable. These rooms on this helical system could not communicate with each other. It couldn't actually succeed, even if, in fact, Babel doesn't happen. And as you know, what happens in this story in Genesis is that God throws a celestial spanner into the works. Man's overweening ambition to become like God, to play God, if you like, or to supplant God, is reduced because nobody can understand anybody else's language. It's a bit like Imperial College, really. But whatever, that's the theme. That's the theme of this talk. Really, it's our use of technology, and whether or not we now can say that we have so much information that we no longer need God, as indeed my friend Richard Dawkins seems to believe. If you go to the Museo Historico di Scienza in Florence, you'll see this holy relic, which, if you ask the curator nicely, he will take out of its cupboard. It's in a glass vial, as all holy relics should be, and he'll put it reverentially on the table in front of you. And it's about that high, I suppose, that glass vial. And if you're very nice to him, he actually, as he did in my case, take the top of the lid off. What it is the middle finger of the right hand held skyward in the gesture most commonly used by those motorbicyclists that pass you in the outside lane at the traffic lights. It is, of course, the middle finger of Galileo's right hand in this sort of kind of celestial defiance. And one of the intriguing questions, of course, which is raised by the whole story of Galileo, who some see as the kind of patron saint of science in his fight against the church, is this really where, in fact, rationality was defeated by religious belief? Now, in my view, I think that actually Galileo has had a remarkably good press. And I think in this instance, the Catholic Church had a very poor press. It's worth considering the actual history of Galileo, which I don't think I've got a lot of time to go into. But one of the things that I must emphasize, it was 16 years before he was forced to abjure, but we'll come back to that. I want to go right back in time to start with. And I want to draw your attention to this phenomenon. And it's something I mentioned in the television series. I took this photograph in the Grotte de Gaga in the Pyrenees in the very southwest tip of France. And this is about 400, 500 meters underground. It's one of these caves which clearly were visited by humans, but it's absolutely obvious that humans didn't actually live in these caves. And if you think about it, it's very clear why. The stalactites and stalagmites, the sound of running water, the extraordinary echo, the dampness, and the fact that if you, as Cro-Magnon man, went down there with a rush light, it would be flickering before you even moved. Once you start going into that environment and move past it, it is astonishingly mysterious. And all we know about those caves is that nobody lived or slept in there. Certainly they didn't die in there, and there are no remains of that sort. But I think that there's reason to believe, and certainly we know that these were inhabited or used 30,000 years ago, that these in one sense are mankind's first known cathedrals. And I want to tell you why I think this is so, and I want to suggest to you that this actually provides a thread for the argument which I will adduce during this presentation. Let me just go forward in time briefly to modern-day Jerusalem and remind you of the western wall of the temple built by Herod, who wasn't a particularly good Jew. In fact, he was an extremely bad Jew, but not a very good Roman citizen either. But the phenomenon I want to draw your attention to is the fact that people go to the western wall, amongst them non-Jews included, to pray every day, because this is a great holy site. Of course, on top, up here, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, holy to Muslims. But if you go up to this wall, and you look even in my photograph, poor though it is, you'll see that there's a whiteness about the cracks. And the reason why the cracks between these stones, which are over 2,000 years old, are white, is because thrust into those cracks are literally tens of thousands of pieces of paper. They are notes on which is written a petition to God. People go to pray, they ask for intercession for a sick relative or for some other reason, and then they leave those notes behind them. Now, let me go back to the Grotte de Gaga. One of the things that is astonishing about the Grotte de Gaga is that there are between 200 to 300 paintings like this on the walls of these caves. They are stencils. And what we know from the paleontologists is that ancient man put his hand against the wall and then, having filled his mouth already with ochre or with charcoal, blew a spray and sprayed a stencil onto the wall. And in some cases, tiny children have got their stencils as well. They were obviously lifted up because they're too high above the ground by their parent or by some other adult so that they could do this. What is happening here? Well, I'm going to argue that in this deep, mysterious, echoing, frightening place, this is an attempt by man, early man, to reach through the cave wall to the transcendental on the other side. And I want to say to you that this may seem far-fetched, but I think there is a lot of evidence to really underpin that what I'm saying is likely to be true. Look at these fingers. What is remarkable, of course, is that the fingers of this hand, all four, are apparently amputated. And when you look at the hands in the Grotte de Gaga, most of them show mutilation, with either 1, 2, or all 4 digits missing, at least at the tips. And lots of theories have been derived. Some people said, well, this is because they mutilated themselves in some kind of ritual. And others said, well, this is at the time of one of the great ice ages in the south of France, and clearly this is frostbite. It doesn't really hold water, because one of the things that we see immediately is that on all the handprints, the thumb is invariably intact. And secondly, what skeletons have been dug out at the entrance to the caves and in the surrounding environs of the cage are complete skeletons, and nobody's found mutilated or missing digits. What is, I think, interesting is that it is likely that what is happening here is that the stencils are produced by Cro-Magnon man doing this with his hand and then blowing. He's actually deliberately lowering a finger, 4 fingers, 5 fingers, and the thumb up, depending on different situations. What he's doing here, of course, is what happens in even hunter-gatherer tribes today, where the silent hunter, in order to signal the deer that he is following, will raise those 2 fingers for the horns of the deer, pointing in that direction. And that is where they would go, a silent sign. And this would argue that this is a kind of intercession for the food that these people are seeking. It may seem far-fetched, but what is extraordinary is that Jean Clot, working in these caves, a very distinguished paleontologist, has found many slivers of bone. And the slivers of bone are not human. They are invariably from one of the few animal species that they would hunt, either deer or bison, or in some cases, I think, elephant were found. They could not have been in those caves. They were put there by early man in his attempt to pray for intercession. So this notion of human spirituality, I think, is deeply embedded, and I suspect it's something which is genetically determined to some extent. If we go forward to last Easter in Rome, we can still see the kind of impact that this spirituality has. This is a photograph I took from one of the balconies in St. Peter's, with this remarkable crowd, and the absolutely moving figure of the Pope speaking from this window. Well, when I say speaking, actually unable to speak because of the advanced Parkinson's diseases, and as you know, within a week or so, he had died. But what is, I think, quite extraordinary and deeply impressive and very moving was that there were a large number of people in that square who certainly were not Catholics, many of whom were not Christians, some of whom were not religious. But nobody could not be moved by the sight of a man who's demonstrating, above all, the central pillar of human morality, which is the notion that life is sacred, which is why he feels compelled to be at that window. And that, I think, is the central tenet in so much of our faiths, and something that we have in common. It's something which is still, I think, ingrained in our being. So this is seen in all sorts of different ways. In Islam, this, by the way, is a photograph I took in Isfahan about a year ago in the great mosque in that wonderful square in Isfahan, where, of course, Muslims, not wanting to depict the human form in any way, have gone for the ultimate of geometric design in its utter exquisite beauty. And again, of course, this wish not to depict the human form is also a notion of the sanctity of the human. And it's seen in all sorts of different ways in different expressions. Coming forward in time, although, of course, well, actually, the great mosque, of course, there was built in only 400 years ago. But let me just give you one other example in Britain. One of the things that really, I think, is extraordinarily moving is this notion of Stonehenge. It is remarkable to consider that these stones weigh some 44 tons. And we know absolutely for certain that they come from Welsh mountainsides. We know exactly where they were carved. These people took these stones 240 miles across country. Maybe they used the Avon part of the way, but whatever they did, the effort in doing that, simply because there's a spiritual need to go for something approaching the transcendental, is, I think, a truly remarkable human instinct. It is, I think, a very moving comment on humanity. Think of the suffering and the damage they must have done to themselves to get those stones into position. Is there actually any evidence, of course, that, and this, by the way, let me emphasize, is an open question. It's really for us to discuss, and that's why I show this. Is there any evidence to suggest that we have a genetic imperative or some genetic tendency towards spirituality? Well, one possibility is the work of Dean Hamer, who is at Bethesda, Maryland, and NIH. And Dean has looked at several hundred families and tried to look at variations in different genes which encode for certain neurotransmitters, one of which is the VMAT2 gene, which is involved with a dopamine-like neurotransmitter. And what he's found in quite a large cohort of people, I think when I last talked to him, at some 400 or 500 people, that there were particular configurations of that gene in people who tended to have a religious disposition based on a very detailed questionnaire. Now, it's only a slight tendency, but it was a significant trend. Another rather more compelling example is the work that's been done by Tom Bouchard, also in the States, in Minnesota. And this is rather a complicated slide, and I won't deal with it in detail. But, you know, in the 60s, it was commonplace for twins, if they were going to be adopted, to be separated at birth. And what's more, the American authorities who were involved with adoption decided that it would be socially desirable if one twin did not know of the other twin's existence, and in many cases, even the families who were adopting didn't know that there was another sibling. What Tom Bouchard has done painstakingly over many years, publishing some really exciting papers mostly in the 80s and 90s, some of them more high profile, some of them more controversial than others, is to look as to trace these twins and to compare the monozygotic twins who will have identical genes with the dizygotic twins coming from two eggs who will have, therefore, be just like brother and sister but not identical. And irrespective of the environment in which these twins are reared, what is interesting is that in the twins that are genetically identical, there is a very greater congruence in their religiosity and religiousness. So, for example, if one twin was interested in a religious leisure time several hundred miles away, the other one might be, even if it was brought up in an atheist family, irrespective of whether one family was Jewish, one was atheist, one was Catholic, one was Protestant, and so on. And it's only where extrinsic religiousness comes in, which is simply defined by going to church because you want to belong to a community or because you want to be seen there, where these things did not demonstrate any statistical significance. I can't go into great detail with Bouchard's research, which has been heavily published in good journals like Science, but essentially what he is proposing is that in many cases there seems to be a genetic predisposition to spirituality. Does this make any kind of sense? Well, if we believe in the selfish gene, maybe we do. In my view, Richard Dawkins' whole proposition about the selfish gene should be under much heavier attack than it is. Because for one thing, it's very clear, with all due respect to Richard, I don't think he seems to understand the phenomenon of epigenetics. And we now know that inheritance can change much more quickly than he proposes. And certainly the usual response to our environment is a good deal more complex than I think he recognized in his early work. Nonetheless, his book, The Selfish Gene, is a huge statement. Can there be a possibility that our spirituality might help us to survive? Well, this is a picture, of course, of Auschwitz. And Viktor Frankl was a medically qualified individual who was interred there and, unlike most people, survived. He quotes Nietzsche, by the way, at the bottom here, what doesn't actually kill me makes me stronger. What he says in his book, which I strongly recommend, is that he went through three phases of thinking in Auschwitz. The first was sheer terror and disbelief that he could be treated with such indifference by his Nazi guards. Then there was a period when, having been saved and being sufficiently fit to go into the workforce, working in the forest, breaking up stones for 6 to 9 months in sub-zero temperatures during the winter, sharing a bunk with 7 other people with no change of clothing for 6 months and 1 sheet, and being covered quite often in excrement because all of them at different times had diarrhea, and being consistently and constantly hungry. He describes one moment in the second phase of existence where he saw one of his best friends from Vienna secreting a crust of bread in his pocket, and then as he was walking through the forest in minus 10 degrees, noticed that his shoes were falling apart. And he admits that his only thought was not, well, if he gets frostbite, the poor man is done for, he's one of my friends, because of course it would mean that he'd go to the gas chambers, but actually he will be taken off to the gas chambers. Where did he put that piece of bread? Which pocket did I see him put it into before he goes? And then Frankl says something very extraordinary. He says there came one winter night which was starry, and somebody crawled in exhaustion on their hands and knees into the hut and said, you must come outside for a moment. Come and look at the sky, because it is truly remarkable. And some of them crawled out to have a look. And they saw the Milky Way in its wonder. And Frankl said that in his view, and I think I've got a quote from him here, that he felt his friends shouldn't lose hope. They should understand that there was something looking down at them. Maybe a god, maybe somebody alive or dead, maybe a friend, maybe a relative. What Frankl says is that in his impression, his experience, that the people who survived Auschwitz were the people who showed some kind of spirituality. And if you think about it, perhaps that spirituality has been helpful to mankind and helped us to survive, and maybe even selected for an evolution. Now, I want to emphasize that none of these comments are arguing for or against the existence of a deity. That, in a sense, in this argument, at this stage, is irrelevant. The point I want to make is that it should be of great concern. Many of us in this audience are scientists, and it should be very much a concern to us when a fellow scientist talks about the God delusion. To my mind, that kind of language is not at all helpful either to science or indeed to understanding something about our humanity. And forgive me for flitting around, but I want to come to my own subject. And I've chosen for this talk this painting by Caravaggio. It's a remarkable episode. It's the most puzzling episode, I think, in the entire Old Testament. It shows Abraham about to slit the throat of Isaac. The angel on the left is pointing to the ram caught in the thickets by its horns, and he's saying, don't sacrifice your son because there is a ram there to sacrifice. Now, in Muslim tradition, of course, it's not the story is altered, but forgive me if I deal with the Jewish version, which is in the Old Testament. Now, there are a number of things about this painting which are extremely puzzling. First of all, Caravaggio himself is painted in about 1603, incidentally, very interestingly, possibly for Cardinal Barberini, who became Pope Urban VIII, the very pope in front of whom Galileo was finally arraigned. But the first thing that's interesting is that both the face of the angel and the face of Isaac show clearly the same model is used for the two individuals. There's a notion of the divinity of Isaac, I think, in that. And the second thing is, what's this whole story about? What is the binding of Isaac really about? Isaac goes up the hill quite meekly, not in fact complaining, not in fact frightened. This rictus affair on his face is absent from the biblical story. Something is happening here that Caravaggio has seen which does not appear in the text. And it is interesting that Isaac goes up the mountain, at Mount Moriah, carrying on his back the very wood which will be part of the sacrifice. It has a resonance, of course, with Christian tradition as well. But he goes meekly, he doesn't go complaining, he doesn't go frightened. Now, in order, I think, to understand this, I need to backtrack a little bit. One of the extraordinary episodes which occurs in Genesis earlier on is that at one point, when God promises Abraham that he'll become a great nation, and Abraham says, "What will you give me, God, else I go childless?" And in the Hebrew, he uses a word for childless, which is an extraordinarily strong word, ariri, which means more than just childless. It means deserted, desolate, forgotten, forsaken. And what happens in that episode is that his son is effectively promised to him. Not directly, but indirectly. What actually happens in the story is that, to take the King James's version, and behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, this man shall not be thine heir being Eliezer, his servant, who he's referring to, because he says, what will you give me? I go childless. The servant in my house will be my heir because there's nobody else. He says that Eliezer shall not be my heir, but he that cometh forth from thine own bowels shall be thine heir. The notion here, of course, is somebody who is genetically related to him. The Hebrew is quite specific. Yetze memecho comes actually from within you. And there is a notion here of his mortality and immortality produced by his children. And that is associated with something which Viktor Frankl identifies with. Because the next line in the Bible is Abraham being led outside to look at the stars, to look at the transcendental, to understand that actually he can't count the stars, they are countless, but they will be as numberless as his children on earth. There is a notion there of heritage produced through a genetic line. And that, I think, is really a very interesting idea. What is also interesting is something in the Hebrew, and that's why I put the Hebrew up here. You know, Judaism is interesting. If you wanted to have a quick flip idea of the three great monotheistic religions, one might say that Christianity perhaps is typified by the idea of love. That is perhaps a strong notion that runs through Christianity. In Islam, there's a notion of submission to Allah, to the Almighty, to the All-Powerful, to the All-Merciful. In Judaism, there's a different idea. The idea is one of, in Hebrew, mishpat, which is justice. There's a notion that God will deal justly with humans. And it's very much in this sort of story. Because, of course, if you remember, Jews throughout the Old Testament argue with God. There's no other religion that does that. When, for example, God says to Abraham, I intend to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah because there are evil people in it, Abraham answers quite sarcastically, remarkably sarcastically, saying, well, shall the most mighty judge of all the earth not deal justice? Suppose I can find 50 righteous men in those cities. Will you still destroy them? There's a pause. And then he says, well, perhaps I can find 40 righteous men. And then a few moments later, maybe, don't be angry, God, maybe I can find 30 righteous men. And then 10, down to 10. Finally, he stops pleading. And that argument goes right through. What is happening here is this man who's had a conversation with God face to face in this story says, V'hinei davar Hashem elav, behold, the word of the Lord came to him. There's no conversation. It's an instinct. The notion is a genetic idea which is bound really inside, somewhere inside him. And I think that what is also interesting and tied up with this idea of mortality is our notion of children. This wonderful woodcut by Van der Goes in Oxford, in Christchurch College, of Jacob with his favoured wife, Rachel, Leah being ignored. And of course, what is interesting in the Bible is that this story of these flawed people, all the patriarchs and matriarchs are flawed in Jewish tradition. All of them are infertile. Sarah's infertile, Rebecca's infertile, both Leah and Rachel are all infertile. It's the theme for the book which follows the story of God, by the way. I want to just come very briefly to something which is connected in reproduction, and that is a question which has really been very much central to my own research existence, the notion of the human embryo and whether it could be seen to be a human being. And in order to try and tease out those difficult questions about which we will disagree in this room, I want to go back to the woodcut by Nicholas Hartcirker, the very famous woodcut. You remember that Nicholas Hartcirker was the man who used the microscope to look at seminal fluid, and he chose to look at his own seminal fluid when he was 19 after a visit to Van Leeuwenhoek using his microscope. He saw wriggling animalcules down the microscope and was so horrified he assumed he had some terrible disease, and for the next 2 years didn't look at seminal fluid again. But eventually this drawing appeared in the Essai de dioptrie published in Paris in 1703, but probably dates from earlier than that. And it's difficult to know whether Hartcirker really believed he could see a little man inside the sperm. But it was generally thought that the little homunculus inside every sperm was a complete human being in the Aristotelian tradition, the idea that women don't, in fact, have any part in reproduction. They're merely incubators. It's an idea which, of course, has informed much of my clinical existence, that men really carry the seed and put it in a woman's uterus. Why it's interesting to me is because of a very obscure rabbi writing in the same century, rather later, in the book called the Sefer HaBrit, which is a very obscure book which I dug off some shelves some time ago, and I've never been able to find it again, but I did at the time translate it from the Mishnaic Hebrew. And the translation, I'm afraid, isn't perfect. But what Pinchas Elijah ben Meir seems to be saying is this, that it's been seen through the viewing instrument called a microscope, that a drop of a man's sperm, he means seminal fluid, whilst yet in its original, he uses the Hebrew word for temperature, or the Aramaic word for temperature. It's not really quite right. He means, I think, environment, contains small creatures in man's image. They live and move within the sperm. And then he says, now you can understand how right the sages were to decide that hashhatat zerah, destruction of the seed, destruction of the sperm, masturbation or whatever, wastage of the sperm, is like murder. So what he's saying here is quite simple. Here are little people who will grow into big people. They're human beings, and therefore any attempt to destroy them is in fact wrong, because it is against the notion of the sanctity of human life. And if you think about it, the ethics are absolutely impeccable, but they're wrong. And the reason why they're wrong, of course, is because they are only as good as the understanding of the natural world around us. And we now know from the use of more modern microscopes and better machinery that what we see in the sperm head is certainly not a little person, but a condensation of the nucleus which leads to the DNA, half the DNA given to the child. And that, I think, is interesting, because I think one of the issues for us when we consider ethics is to recognize that our ethics can only really be as good as our scientific understanding. There is a connection. The two have to go hand in hand. It is impossible to deny the science, which is one of the reasons why, in this instance, I rather take issue with the Catholic view that life begins at conception. Because, of course, to the biologist, there's no beginning of life. It's a continuum. Life doesn't start at any point. And indeed, if it were true that life began at conception, at fertilization, you'd have to say that this mouse was never alive, because this mouse, published in Nature a couple of years ago, is the parthenogenetically produced mouse in Japan. You remember it, perhaps. That was produced by simply activating the egg by pricking it. And as you can see, this mouse has to be female, because it doesn't have any Y chromosome. Obviously, it never saw a sperm, but it's quite fertile and produces, after mating, a normal litter of 14 small mice. Now, admittedly, of course, it's not very easy to activate eggs in this situation. It's done in this situation because of some epigenetic changes. Some of the imprinted genes are not actually functioning normally. But nonetheless, it is a mouse. Or is it? Is it just a fiction? In my mind, it's a mouse. And it has to be seen as one, and certainly it's Austringer mice. But in a sense, it was never conceived. Let's come to Galileo. Galileo, in a way, had to deal with these differences in a tricky way as well. Firstly, of course, he saw the Pope spending money like this on these vast machines which demonstrated that the Earth was at the center of the universe, which he knew to be wrong. And there's this wonderful story about him trying to persuade one of his colleagues at Padua University in 1608, having just fashioned his new telescope, that come and look at Jupiter, he says, because here you can see a perfect example of where, in fact, bodies inside the universe will actually go around each other and not necessarily around the Earth. And Giulio Libri, Professor Libri, replies, I don't need to look down your telescope. I know the truth of things as they are. That is the sort of perfect ultimate position. Actually, a few months after that conversation, sadly, Giulio Libri died, and Galileo is reported to have said this: if he didn't care to look at the heavens while he was on Earth, perhaps he might care to now he's on the way up. But I must move on, because, of course, to some extent, that attitude is an attitude which we have too frequently in modern science as well. And I don't want to go on at great length about Richard Dawkins, because it's not fair. In a sense, he's not here to defend himself, but he has published a book called The God Delusion, so he has laid himself rather open to argument. More to the point is his comment on 9/11. And what he says about 9/11, I think, shows a fundamental misunderstanding. What he said in this newspaper article, which I think was published in The Guardian, it came from religion. Religion is also, of course, the underlying source of divisiveness in the Middle East, which motivated this deadly weapon in the first place, but that is another story and is not my concern here. My concern here is with the weapon itself. To fill the world with religion, or religions of the Abrahamic kind, is like littering the streets with loaded guns. Do not be surprised if they are used. And sadly, this kind of rhetoric, though of course it holds very little water when you really examine it, has certainly informed a huge number of people, I think, in our society and in my view is highly dangerous. Highly dangerous for two reasons, because I think actually it's an incitement to think violently in itself, and secondly, because it's a misunderstanding of the very basic morality from which Richard Dawkins himself comes. Richard Dawkins, after all, was educated in a religious school, Oundle, which was founded in the 17th century. He goes to a university which is based entirely on religious notions, Oxford University, where, of course, in the Middle Ages, most of the dons would have been priests. And he himself is admired, as I admire him, because of his quintessential Englishness. That quintessential Englishness, in his case, in my view, comes from the Anglican tradition of which he is a proud inheritor, actually. And in a sense, I believe that it's that Anglican tradition which has been so formative, in a positive way, in English culture, which has led to our understanding of justice, our understanding of tolerance, and the kind of society that we all, I think, in different ways would like to see. It's not exclusive to Christianity, but certainly in this country it has been a very positive influence. And this is not, in my view, helpful. I'm going to move on very quickly because I'm very conscious that I want to have some talk. I just want to talk very briefly about work that we're doing in my own lab, and then I'm going to stop. You know, one of the things I've stated to you is that the central tenet, it seems to me, of all the monotheistic religions, and forgive me if I exclude the religions of the Far East, one of which, of course, one notably, is atheist, i.e. Buddhism, is this notion of the sanctity of life. We will have, no doubt, in due course, the opportunity to change permanently the genes of mammals. This is an experiment I've been doing in my own laboratory, which involves inserting a gene construct into the testis of a baby mouse, and Carol Reedhead and I have had huge success now in getting large numbers of transgenic animals. I think it's only a matter of time before an efficient technique, once it's efficient, could be used in the human. And it raises very interesting questions. Could we enhance humans in various ways? If you go to, for example, Sardinia, you will come across the Mamatones, who dance through the streets once a year. They are there in this garb, which they've been dancing through the streets every year since the 17th century. These masks, by the way, are handed down from father to son. They are there to dance out the devil. Who's the devil? Well, in their case, it's this little boy, Emanuele, who is got the devil inside him, because he is suffering, as 1 in 6 of that population do, from the beta thalassemia gene, a double O's. He's a homozygote, and he has to have blood transfusions so frequently that he will eventually have iron overload, organ failure, diabetes if he lives long enough, and so on. And if you go to hospitals in Sardinia, it's a pretty depressing experience, because wards are filled with children in their teens, and many of these children might survive until their mid-20s at best. Most don't. But his brother here is a heterozygote with only 1 copy of the gene. If our testicular injection could be done, why not insert the gene into his sperm, so that, into the stem cells of his sperm, so that actually when he produces children in future, that population that he gives rise to, his immortality would be immortal. It's an interesting question. Why not enhance humans in this sort of way? And if we're going to do that, why not go a stage further? Well, there's a very interesting question about this, and I want to very briefly talk about the notion of enhancing humans from my own religious perspective. You know, one of the arguments that goes on in Judaism is the argument which is continued long after the Bible in the Talmud, which is, and this is from about the 3rd century, about the year 200. Simeon the Hossid points out that God says that they've produced a new creature in the world which I didn't create. The creature which may, in fact, if I bring it upon them, will be evil. And he is referring here to this creature called the Arod. What is the Arod? Well, if you go to another tractate of the Talmud, Tractate Chulin, which not many people bother to read because it's pretty difficult stuff, you come across this remarkable statement. And it tells you something rather wonderful about the way the oral tradition is carried out in Judaism, with at least a sense of humor. Rabbi Huna says in the name of another rabbi, Rabbi Torta, that he was once walking along the way to Lava'ad, and he saw on the ground a serpent entwined around a tortoise. I don't know how you translate Hatsav in Aramaic, but I think it's a tortoise. I've not been able to find it in any dictionary, but I'm told it's probably a tortoise. And after some days, there came forth an arod, this threatening animal, which of course is genetically engineered. And the question really is, what's the response of the Talmudic rabbis? How do you deal with this? And what is lovely is here, this is the response in actually 8 words. And let me translate it for you. If you see somebody from that part of the world and kiss them, just count your teeth afterwards. The notion, of course, is that we really can't judge this, that there's a degree of uncertainty about the position, that actually we're dealing again and again with uncertainty. And I think there is something really interesting here which is raised by this sort of ruling which happens again and again. Let's just come back to Micheli for a second. One of the things about Micheli, of course, is that if you look closely at his forehead, you see that it's bowed. And the reason why it's bowed, of course, is that every bone that can make marrow to make more blood cells is pumping out red cells. And the reason why it's doing that, of course, is because of the severe anemia. And what is extraordinary is that if you go to Sardinia and look at skulls that have been dug up there, you will find plentiful evidence that that's been going on for generations. Some 3,000 years ago, carbon-dated skulls, exactly this deformity was seen in adult skulls. This population has survived in spite of this deadly gene. Actually, of course, they might have survived because of this deadly gene. If global warming continues and Anopheles gambiae comes up from Africa once again, children like this would no longer have any protection, because one of the things about these blood disorders is that they protect against malaria. And there's a notion here that we have to recognize that much of our science and its consequences are uncertain. And therefore, to enhance humans in any way, in this kind of way, is something perhaps which we should not go. Yes, of course, playing God is desirable. There's nothing wrong with playing God. In my view, playing God is simply using what we are given, surely, to promote life. But what we have to be careful is not to supplant God in that. It seems to me that that really is the message here. And to my mind, that is something where we have to say that where science and religion are both about, essentially, uncertainty. Our science is done because we don't know where we're coming from, we don't know where we've gone to. We don't know what's beyond us in the heavens, and that is true, of course, in religion as well. When God appears out of the whirlwind to Job at the end of this extraordinary book in the 42nd chapter, he says something extraordinary to Job. Job in Jewish tradition is not Jewish, he's every man. He represents humanity. This is not a test of Job, this is a test of God. And God is not to be tested. He says, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if you have understanding. Where are the foundations fastened? Who laid the cornerstone? Hast thou entered the springs of the sea? Have you been to the bottoms of the ocean? Do you know where you're going to? Do you know where you're coming to? Have you seen the doors of the shadow of death?" What God is essentially saying is that there are things beyond your understanding. The tsunami is not to be explained. There are things with which we cannot cope. You live with uncertainty. That is the notion of our existence. And it seems to me that what is troubling in science is when science actually reckons that it does have the answers. In fact, as we get more and more into quantum physics, and I think quantum will appear in modern biology increasingly, we begin to understand how little we do actually understand. To go back to the Tower of Babel, if you go to Geneva tomorrow and go across to the French border, go deep underground, there's a structure under that ground which is 14 stories high, over which people of all nations are clambering as I speak. There's a clamoring and clattering of hammers, all sorts of the latest modern technology, with the largest computers ever built by man. And here I'm standing inside one of the biggest magnets to be switched on in the year 2007. What's it for? It's for the Higgs boson, to try and understand the better nature of particle physics, to recreate the beginnings of the universe at Big Bang. And the interesting question is, if they find the Higgs boson, yes, it might demonstrate that much of what we believe about modern physics is correct and some of modern mathematics is wrong. If we don't find the Higgs boson, does that mean to say that all our theories are wrong? Or is that just an example of God throwing yet another spanner, celestial or otherwise, into the works? I think, to summarize, what I would argue is that we should recognize that both religion and science are essentially about our uncertainty. And it's really only when they become certain that they are then at their most dangerous. Whether they're religion or science, it seems to me that we should be sufficiently recognizing of our humbleness in the general notion of things, and that seems to be a good moment to stop. Thank you.
You've been listening to a special lecture vodcast from Imperial College London.